The United States has only existed for about 250 years. That's younger than the violin. And in that short amount of time, it fought a revolution against the most powerful empire on Earth, tore itself apart in a civil war that killed more Americans than every other war combined, and somehow ended up as the most powerful nation in human history. Oh, and the whole thing kicked off because a king wanted tea money. So, how did 13 scrappy colonies turn into a global superpower? Let's start at the beginning. Long before any Europeans set foot on the continent, millions of indigenous people were already living across North America, organized into hundreds of distinct nations with their own languages, governments, and trade networks. Then, in 1492, an Italian sailor working for Spain showed up looking for a shortcut to Asia and stumbled into an entire hemisphere instead. Columbus never set foot in what would become the United States, but he opened the door. Other Europeans walked right through it. The English tried first at Roanoke. The colony vanished without a trace. Not a great start. Then, in 1607, they tried again at Jamestown, Virginia. This time, it stuck. Barely. The settlers nearly starved to death in the first few years. They were saved by something almost nobody expected: tobacco. Turns out Europeans loved smoking it, and suddenly Jamestown had a business model. More colonies followed. Plymouth in 1620, founded by pilgrims looking for religious freedom, who promptly demanded everyone else follow their religion too. Within decades, 13 British colonies stretched down the Atlantic coast, each one developing its own economy, its own culture, and its own opinions about how much they actually needed the king back in London telling them what to do. For over a century, Britain mostly left the colonies alone. Then, Britain fought an expensive war against France for control of North America, and won. Great news for Britain, terrible news for the colonists, because now Britain wanted the bill paid. "We won you this land. Someone has to pay for it." "We didn't ask you to fight that war." "Doesn't matter. New taxes. Stamps, sugar, tea, glass, paper. We don't even have anyone representing us in Parliament." "That's not really my problem." That attitude did not age well. In 1773, angry colonists dumped an entire shipment of British tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the tax on it. Britain responded by shutting down the entire port of Boston. Tensions kept rising until April 1775, when British troops marched to seize colonial weapons at Lexington and Concord, and someone fired a shot nobody has ever been able to identify. The American Revolution had begun. On July 4, 1776, delegates from all 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence, written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, declaring that they were no longer subjects of the British Crown. Bold move for a group of farmers and lawyers facing the most powerful military on the planet. The war dragged on for 8 brutal years. George Washington lost more battles than he won, but he kept the army alive, and that was enough. In 1781, with critical help from the French Navy, American and French forces trapped the British Army at Yorktown. Britain surrendered. The impossible had happened. 13 colonies had beaten an empire. But winning independence and actually running a country turned out to be two very different problems. The new nation's first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation, was so weak the federal government couldn't even collect taxes or enforce its own laws. "Sir, the states are refusing to send money for the army. Can we force them to pay? We have no power to force anyone to do anything. Then what exactly can we do? Mostly just ask nicely." That system collapsed fast, so in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia and wrote an entirely new constitution, creating a stronger federal government split into 3 branches, designed specifically so no single person or institution could grab too much power. George Washington became the first president in 1789. He could have been king in everything but name. Instead, he walked away after 2 terms, setting a precedent that would hold for a century. The young country immediately started growing. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson bought the entire Louisiana territory from France, doubling the size of the United States overnight for the bargain price of about 4 cents an acre. Then, in 1812, America picked a fight it probably shouldn't have, declaring war on Britain again over trade restrictions and forced sailor conscription. British troops actually marched into Washington and burned down the White House. Not America's finest moment. The war ended in a draw, but it convinced Americans they could stand up to a great power and survive. Over the following decades, the country kept pushing westward, driven by a belief that expanding across the entire continent was basically destiny. That expansion came at a horrific cost to the native nations already living there, who were forced off their lands again and again, often at gunpoint, most brutally during the forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands of Cherokee people during a single winter march. The nation was growing, but it was also splitting apart underneath over one specific, unresolvable issue: slavery. By the 1850s, the North had built an economy on free labor and industry. The South had built its entire economy on forced labor of enslaved people. Every new state that joined the Union reopened the same explosive question. If Kansas enters as a free state, the balance shifts against us. Then Kansas enters as a slave state. The people there don't want that. Then the people there are wrong. In 1860, Lincoln won the presidency without a single electoral vote from the South. Southern states saw the writing on the wall and started seceding before he even took office. By April 1861, the Civil War had begun. It became the deadliest conflict in American history. Roughly 620,000 soldiers died, more than every other American war combined up to that point. Brothers sometimes fighting against brother. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. It didn't end slavery everywhere immediately, but it changed the entire purpose of the war. In April 1865, the Confederacy finally collapsed. 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated at a theater in Washington, shot by an actor furious about the South's defeat. The man who held the country together didn't live to see it rebuilt. The decades after the war brought explosive growth. Railroads stitched the continent together, immigrants poured in by the millions, and factories transformed sleepy towns into industrial cities almost overnight. A handful of businessmen became unimaginably wealthy, building oil empires, steel empires, and railroad empires, while the workers building those fortunes often labored in brutal, dangerous conditions for pennies a day. This era earned the nickname the Gilded Age, shiny gold coating on the outside, rot underneath. By 1917, a massive war was tearing Europe apart, and America tried its best to stay out of it. Sir, another passenger ship has been sunk. American citizens were aboard. We are not entering a European war. Germany is now openly attacking our ships. We stay out of it. Congress does not agree with you anymore. America entered World War I and helped tip the balance toward an Allied victory. The 1920s that followed roared with jazz, new wealth, and reckless financial speculation, right up until October 1929, when the stock market collapsed and triggered the Great Depression. Banks failed, a quarter of the workforce lost their jobs, and families lost their homes overnight. President Franklin Roosevelt responded with a massive set of programs called the New Deal, putting people back to work and rebuilding the shattered economy piece by piece. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 people in a single morning. America declared war within 24 hours and threw itself fully into World War II, fighting across 2 oceans simultaneously. American factories that had once built cars now built tanks and bombers around the clock. By 1945, after brutal fighting across Europe and the Pacific, the war ended. America walked away as one of only 2 true superpowers left standing on Earth. But peace didn't mean comfort. The other true superpower, the Soviet Union, had a completely opposite system, and for the next 40 decades, the 2 nations never fired a shot directly at each other, but came terrifyingly close more than once. Sir, Soviet missiles have been confirmed in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Nuclear missiles pointed directly at us. If we strike first, they retaliate. If we do nothing, they're already armed. So what exactly are our options? Right now, sir, we don't have a good one. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the entire planet within days of nuclear war before both sides backed down. Meanwhile, at home, Black Americans were fighting a different battle entirely, against laws that had kept them segregated and disenfranchised a century after slavery officially ended. Leaders like Martin Luther King organized massive, deliberately nonviolent protests against brutal, often violent resistance. It took over a decade of marches, boycotts, and immense personal sacrifice before major civil rights laws finally passed in the 1960s, dismantling legal segregation nationwide. The Cold War dragged the country into Vietnam, a war that grew wildly unpopular at home and ended in withdrawal rather than victory. It stretched into a decades-long space race against the Soviets, one that culminated in July 1969 when American astronauts became the first humans to walk on the surface of the moon. Then, in 1991, after years of economic strain, the Soviet Union simply collapsed. The Cold War that had defined half a century of American life ended not with a battle, but with a quiet dissolution. For a brief stretch in the 1990s, America stood essentially unchallenged. That sense of security shattered on September 11, 2001, when terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, killing nearly 3,000 people in a single morning. The country launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that would stretch on for 2 full decades. In 2008, a financial crisis triggered by risky mortgage lending nearly collapsed the global economy, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth and costing millions of Americans their homes and jobs almost overnight. Through all of it, the country kept reinventing itself. It elected its first Black president in 2008. It built the most powerful technology industry on the planet. It remained, for better or worse, the place the rest of the world still watches most closely. 250 years ago, 13 colonies took on an empire because a king wanted tea money and refused to listen. Revolution, Civil War, Depression, World War, Cold War, and a nation still arguing with itself about exactly who gets to be included in that opening promise, that all men are created equal. The country never actually finished becoming itself. It's still writing the next chapter, one argument at a time.